Linda Stevens, OATI. Thanks so much for joining me. It's great to see you.
Thank you, John. It's my pleasure to be here today.
Yeah, and I'm really excited about talking about not only DERMS, but just the broader grid software ecosystem and how utilities and grid operators are approaching what is a rapidly changing energy landscape amid this transition that we're in. So really looking forward to unpacking that with you, especially since OATI is so involved in a number of those dynamics and working with customers in the field. Before we get to all of that, please do take an opportunity to introduce yourself and a bit about your background and then your role with OATI.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. But before I jump into that, I have to say one word I really appreciate you mentioned was the term ecosystem, because that really is the world that we're entering into now. You've got a lot of systems that are interoperating and interplaying, to help support a much more dynamic grid than we've ever had before. So I appreciate your sentiments on that. So yeah, my name again is Linda Stevens. I'm a Senior Vice President of Sales here at OATI. I'm also a Chief Strategy Officer for our Smart Grid and Smart City Solution set. I've had the great privilege to dedicate my entire career in the energy space. And this last part of it has been really successfully conducted with OATI for the last going on 13 years now.
Awesome. Well, before we dive into what separates a DERMS platform from another, because I think that's an important distinction given all of the rhetoric that you hear in the industry about the players that have this product offering or this other one and what's actually ready for prime time, I think is a valuable conversation. Let's set a foundational understanding of what we're actually talking about here. So what in principle should a DERMS platform do? Maybe we should start there.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. So as you mentioned earlier, so with the energy transition, which is the world that we're all working to solve, managing and leveraging the proliferation of demand side assets, either currently on the grid or coming onto the grid, is fast becoming mission critical and central to distribution operations. In the simplest terms, from a utility perspective, a robust DERMS, or Distributed Energy Resource Management System, should enable the integration of and operationalize the widest variety of DR and DER assets that are becoming more prevalent and common at the grid edge. A DERMS, therefore, is a common platform for controlling both DR and DER behind the meter and front of the meter assets under a single pane of glass. It provides the ability to aggregate these assets into resources. We call them virtual power plants or VPPs as well, and provides forecasting, scheduling, and dispatching capabilities for those assets. A robust DERMS should also consider the impact of those assets on the grid and perform measurement and verification functions to track the performance of the DER resources. And I think another key thing that really is central to a robust DERMS under the should category is, most importantly, a DERMS must model and manage both grid operations and the related commercial operations and contract parameters associated with the DERs. As most of the DERs are now customer owned as opposed to utility owned. So commercial operations are essential to tracking program performance as they support accurate customer infrastructure structures that are needed to inspire customer enrollment. So that's essentially what a DERMS should do and does.
That's super helpful, and I think important, because DERMS, due to the opportunity with DERMS, has become one of these buzzy terms in our industry that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people and companies. And I think that's certainly reflected in the product offerings that you see in the market, in that, when you buy a box of Band-Aids, there are going to be Band-Aids inside. When you see a product offered as DERMS, you don't necessarily know what that DERMS is going to be, unless you really open the hood, and there aren't a ton of offerings out there that'll allow you to do that. So I think this is going to be a really helpful conversation. Something I want to pull out from what you were just talking about that I thought was really interesting, this concept of a single pane of glass. Explain that a little bit more for me.
Yeah. So that reference really comes from the distribution operator's perspective. You know, I've enjoyed a great career where I've had the opportunity to tour a lot of control centers. And I can share with you that from a real-time grid ops perspective, an operator will have many system displays or panes of glasses from which to work from. They need a lot of data and they have to navigate a lot of systems. And too many panes of glass and too many systems can just be clunky in a real-time control room environment. So less is more sometimes. However, utilities can provide tools that group the relevant data sets into a common platform, like a truly robust DERMS that handles both DR and DER assets behind the meter and front of the meter. Commercial ops and grid ops. That's what I mean by condensing things down into a common pane of glass. Now, that reference also relates to an enterprise class DERMS. It's one of those terminologies that we're starting to hear in the industry. So an enterprise class DERMS, we need to understand its role that it plays within the utility operations. It is the single platform system that interacts with other types of DERMS, the wholesale market, various legacy systems, and is the single source of validation and settlement across all aggregators and curtailment service providers. And it really becomes the utility's single system of record. Again, trying to get that that commonality across all things. So it's a type of a DERMS that bridges the conventional IT/OT structures, orchestrates then nodes, and will be used for both commercial and grid ops that increasingly rely upon non-utility owned DERs. Was that helpful?
No, that's super helpful. And I think we'll get to it a little bit more later on in the conversation, but I like the metaphor of the single pane of glass, because you start to think about too many cooks in the kitchen. And
Yes.
You are seeing within the market a lot of software stacking, where you are using so many different vendors for a number of different responsibilities, which is fairly common in ways, but the interoperability that you're exposed to and have to identify potential, critical challenges that come along with the tangling of the web, to use another one, of all those different pieces of software. So I know we'll get to that a little bit more later. But when we talk about a DERMS platform, so the specific assets that are being managed, help me understand what we're talking about here, and maybe some of the more popular ones that a DERMS is interacting with.
Yeah, so as I stated previously, a really robust DERMS solution should manage both DR and DER assets. And there becomes a little bit of an interesting, sometimes utilities will ask for a DRMS, a demand response management system, and some will ask for a DERMS. And really a robust DERMS will consider a DRMS as just a subset of a DERMS. So both should be prevalent in a real DERMS. And again, a DERMS should handle both behind the meter or BTM and front of the meter or FTM assets, which are more typically utility owned. And again, it should fully support residential and commercial industrial customer classes. Now, common types of BTM assets are still, as an example, smart meters, or smart thermostats. They're on the rise. A lot of us homeowners are starting to adapt them, and many utilities are seeing the advantage of being able to harness those assets as well for grid benefits. So very popular assets, still smart thermostats. Other common BTM assets include customer-owned generators. We see the rise of these as we have really major storm threats. As storms roll through and knock out power, you see a lot of customers moving toward getting their own customer-owned generators. So utilities can take advantage of those. Water heating loads are still popular, heat pumps, irrigation booms. Residential EV charging is definitely on the rise. And I think one of the more popular, I'll say trending asset types that we see this year, really popular in the DERMS space to be managed, are residential home battery packs as well. And there's a lot of players coming onto the market with those. Now, from a front of the meter asset standpoint, very common assets are large battery energy storage systems, solar plus storage sites, and microgrid-based assets. A great example of that is we see a lot of our utility clients starting to put large batteries, locating them next to large EV charging site loads to help them with grid infrastructure. And that's a great solution because you can put a nice hyperlocal controller on that battery so that it orchestrates a nice dance with the EV charging load. But then that battery can be integrated with the DERMS as well, so that the utility operator can use it when it's not being used for the local EV charging load. So those are some pretty common asset types that a DERMS will interoperate with.
Excellent. So it sounds like the big takeaway here is that it has to be able to play with everything. They can't necessarily pick and choose.
Yes, that's right. We want to offer the world to utilities because it's there. They can take advantage of all kinds of different assets.
So let's pull on the thread of the enterprise DERMS a little bit more. And you were talking about that earlier, because I think it's important when you talk about the Swiss Army knife that a DERMS can be, and figuring out what that perfect solution is for a utility that has a number of different demands. There does seem to be this industry movement to classify DERMS into various specific use cases or categories. Is that what you guys are seeing? And maybe help me understand how you're approaching that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, I've seen these classifications emerge, and really within this last business years, you really see them coming on strong. Most often, though, I see them associated with more complex utilities, maybe the investor-owned utilities for sure, and the larger municipal-owned utilities as well, that have really entrenched IT and OT systems. That's where we really see a lot of these categories emerging. I don't see categories as often with rural electric cooperatives, G&Ts, or smaller munis. They just say, I need a DERMS. And they are still looking for very robust functionality. They just haven't made the movement toward grouping some of the logical components together. So that's where we see it emerging. And I would say there are three of more common terms that are starting to rise to the top. Certainly one is enterprise DERMS, like we talked about earlier. There's a grid DERMS, and there seems to be some commonalities around that. But then on the BTM side, you see terms like aggregator DERMS, grid edge DERMS, or edge DERMS, or VPP DERMS. They're all names of something that have a common set of functionality. So we don't want to get too tripped up in names. What really matters is the underlying requirement. But I would say, again, enterprise DERMS, grid DERMS, and we'll just call it aggregator DERMS are the three most common terms.
And let's unpack some of those, because I think the mission of this conversation is to demystify DERMS, because as I mentioned, there is a good amount of clutter, I would say, associated with the technology, because again, the opportunities that it creates and enables are significant. And so I think that's when a market and an industry gets really excited and needs to be purposeful about what it's actually trying to do. And what is the functionality? What is the use case? What are you going to do with that DERMS? So let's start off with enterprise DERMS. When you speak to an enterprise DERMS platform, what are we talking about there?
Yeah, okay, so I love that. Let's start at the top, because that's really kind of how we view the enterprise DERMS classification. So an enterprise DERMS is really a top node DERMS. You hear those terms a lot: top node, then node, top, and then the then nodes integrate up with the top node. So as the enterprise DERMS is a top node, it does create that single pane of glass that we talked about before for all DR and DER programs. And as I said earlier, an enterprise DERMS can do that bridging between commercial and grid ops. Interesting, though, is an enterprise DERMS, a really robust one, can either directly manage, control, and dispatch select DR and DER assets and programs itself directly, and or here's the cool part: incorporate, integrate, interoperate, orchestrate, you pick the word, but it's all about embracing and orchestrating and working with other third-party aggregator systems. Again, to create that, to declutter the control room and get to a common DR/DER system for streamlined operations, right? So then the enterprise DERMS, again, is then the single common point that interacts with aggregators, edge DERMS, grid DERMS, brings all that data into a common spot. It becomes the common place that interacts with the wholesale market. Again, goes wide, integrates with various legacy systems, and is a single source of validation and settlements across all those different players. So that's really what the enterprise DERMS is it's the main orchestrator, bringing all these different systems in together. Yeah, so that's enterprise DERMS view.
No, that's helpful. And that's kind of another layer to that single pane of glass conversation that we were having earlier, and wrapping in all these different tools into a more of a singular and central system. So grid DERMS, and I think this is maybe the bulk of what people think about when they're talking about DERMS, if I'm not mistaken, but I'm curious, like, how you define that in how the market and different players shake out. What are we talking about with grid DERMS?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to kind of, again, share OATI's perspective on what a grid DERMS is. Before I do that, I do want to, there's one comment that I want to share with my one of my utility clients in the investor-owned utility space. When we were having the conversation about an enterprise DERMS, he said to me, Linda, how many DERMS systems do I need to have in this utility? I went, yeah, that's a great question. I don't have the answer for you, but that's what an enterprise system does, is it allows some freedom of choice for different pockets of functionality, but to be able to come together into a common viewpoint. So I think that was a relevant comment to share. So, a grid DERMS. So a grid DERMS tends to be very grid ops centric. It's tightly related to an ADMS. It has real-time visibility into system operations via a distribution SCADA or an ADMS. And it has forecasting and awareness and control of dispatchable DER assets as well. The grid DERMS tends to solve things from an ADMS viewpoint. So the grid DERMS provides information directly to the ADMS about the DERs and the DER forecasts based on the ADMS needs. Furthermore, a grid DERMS tends to be more closely tied to large front-of-the-meter utility-owned assets, just given that they are direct grid connected. So that tends to be what a grid DERMS is. Yeah. So let's just keep it simple, and we'll just generally refer to this grouping as an aggregator DERMS. So generally speaking, an aggregator DERMS is, again, leans toward the customer-owned behind-the-meter assets or grid edge, and it's very grid edge focused. So it tends to handle all the customer-facing functions when you're working with behind-the-meter assets, including an end consumer engagement and enrollment platform. It still does DER forecasting, dispatch and control of the assets by the utility. It handles customer notification, and it does the performance calculation and billing determinants for the programs. But again, more oriented to BTMs as opposed to FDMs. And also really interesting about aggregator DERMS is the pathway to the assets themselves most often is through a managed relationship they have with OEMs. So aggregator DERMS can offer smart thermostats available for control to the utilities, but they're not controlling every single thermostat. They're sending dispatch signals to the head end of the thermostat provider, and then the provider sends the information out. So it's a very very organized way to get to behind the meter assets.
So a quick follow-up there. So when we think about these classifications of DERMS, so that I understand, is the enterprise DERMS the one size fits all, and the grid DERMS and aggregator DERMS are more modular options, or do you look at this as in a suite of tools? Are you deploying an enterprise DERMS to serve as that single access point, but you also have a grid DERMS and you also have an aggregator DERMS? How does that puzzle come together?
Yeah, so I'm still going to go back to, you know, it depends on the utility itself and the use case. So again, not all utilities are grouping these functionalities together. You have less complex utilities that just don't have those functions broken down. And in that case, you can have a single, very robust DERMS that does integrate with an ADMS and does offer OEM-based programs and does a whole bunch of stuff just in and of itself, you know, without the need of another system. But as you move into more complex utilities that maybe have deployed a grid DERMS, or they have one or two of their favorite aggregator DERMS, they've got smart thermostats over here and maybe batteries over here, and they don't want to rip and replace, but they're starting to feel that pain of, I need a common place for all this stuff to go to because I've got scattered thinking and scattered systems, and I can't get, my aggregators don't know how to get to the market, and my DERMS doesn't know how to talk BTMs. That's the perfect opportunity for an enterprise level DERMS to come in and really bring it all together and orchestrate that single DER viewpoint.
Then help me understand why these classifications are forming in the first place, or why they're necessary. When we think about the guardrails that exist for these various tools, and it is helpful for illustrating the opportunity, but why do you think the market is shaking out in that way?
Yeah, oh, well, I mean, I think there's really two reasons behind that. And I think the first is, you know, let's be honest, a full, robust DERMS platform, you know, they're complex. They're not for the faint of heart. They're not easy to build. Plus, in an ever-changing landscape, like you mentioned earlier, they require significant investment just to maintain and evolve. They have to keep up with all the different asset types and the changes that are going on in the marketplace. But vendors tend to develop solutions from their comfort zone. It's natural. So grid DERMS, as an example, has its roots within the ADMS world and expands out from that perspective. But they really don't have real world experience working with BTM assets and customer engagement. It's just, they haven't, their worlds aren't wound that way. Conversely, the BTM aggregator DERMS vendors community, they tend to have limited knowledge about the grid and grid conditions. That's not their world. They don't come from that space either. And both, not all, and there's certainly many exceptions, but both tend to have limited experience interoperating with wholesale markets. That's just a whole nother thing that neither one of them have typically been exposed to. Thus, utilities that understand the need to bridge commercial and grid ops, bring it all together, tend to embrace an enterprise concept DERMS that can play that balancing act and allow the other systems to natively do what they're really good at, but still create that common environment. And I think honestly that the second reason is all about freedom of choice. Given prosumer behavior and buying power, there's a variety of DER, new DER types that are becoming available. And sometimes utilities want to cater to niche solutions for them, as they perceive that one may be better suited for a particular asset type. And that's okay. Utilities should have a choice, consumers should have a choice. But again, an enterprise-wide DERMS can either handle all asset types, kind of in and of itself, or it can encompass third-party aggregators into that platform to, again, create that common DER view.
Excellent. And that goes back to an earlier point I had about, you know, figuring out who's who in the market is difficult, because you do have some vendors that are specifically focused on devices, others that are very focused on communication in the context of ADMS. And then you have the controls piece, and then you have the markets piece and the customer engagement piece. And so you're seeing a lot of I wouldn't even say consolidation at this point, but a lot of linking up between vendors in almost an acknowledgement that our platform on its own may not be able to get you all the way there. Yeah. So you're seeing this repeated stacking, I think, in we do this one thing okay, and maybe they do something else well, and that's how you cobble together a platform. And I think those that don't have to go down that route are starting to differentiate a bit as the technology matures. So as we land the plane here, Linda, from your perspective, what about those classifications should utilities be watching out for when they're figuring out what is right for me? Where should my road begin? And then from there, which of those lanes that we just talked about am I driving down? And to pull on the analogy even further, where are the potholes?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, I think utility folks should be aware that there's a misconception about DERMS in general, and in particular about enterprise DERMS. And there's some misperception that it is an immature technology. And that simply is not true. Enterprise class DERMS and DERMS in general solutions have been evolving and maturing for 15 years. This is not new to some of us by any means. They are deployed in the field, and they do offer an effective way to integrate DER management into control room operations. So under this whole concept of demystifying DERMS, let's demystify it to the point to say, no, it is not only here and now, it has been. So it's a very ripe, robust, present technology now that can be utilized well within utilities. And I think, secondly, utilities should be aware that there is no standard. And utilities love standards. They love protocol standards and all those great things. But when it comes to classifying DERMS, there is no standard, or really no commonly agreed to classification. And that's okay. There's simply a means to help an industry, understand and group requirements. And that's good. We're thinkers that way. But also be aware that they're moving targets. What may be classified as a grid DERMS today might be something different a few years from now. So then, my last pro tip, if you will, when we think about classifications, I would say is just for the utilities, stay focused on the utility perspective. Really understand your world, your requirements, your use cases, your objectives, what's important to you. Don't worry so much about what one vendor names itself or classifies itself. There might be some helpful information in there and kind of guiding things, but don't rely solely on the label that a vendor community would put on under itself. Back to your point, open up that box of Band-Aids. Look at what kind of Band-Aid you need.
Is it a Band-Aid?
Is it a big one?
Ask yourself.
Exactly. What do I really need? And if you stay focused on that, then there's really a beautiful vendor community out there that can help with solving some of your issues.
Excellent. Well, Linda Stevens, thanks so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. Appreciate the time.